Hey everybody, this is Dan Nichols with Bioscan360.ai, and I came to all that. I actually started my own business here around artificial intelligence scanning of the heart because over the summer I was in Chicago at a health expo, and I met a guy over in the corner, a man and a woman, and they had this AI heart scanning, cardiac scanning equipment, and they said, "Let us hook you up to it." Long story short, that led me to Dr. Sam Fillingane, who I'm on the line with right now here on this call. Thank you for being here, doctor.
It's nice to be here.
And Dr. Sam has a pretty interesting experience. He's done a lot in his lifetime. He is a cardiovascular risk reduction specialist, and he's the first doctor to reduce plaque medically. So he's got kind of some cool things that have happened in his lifetime around all that. But the way I met Dr. Sam was after I had my scan. Only a licensed medical professional can actually interpret the results of the scan. And he's going to share with you my scan after actually having that AI heart scan done. But here's what really matters and what I want to share. For 20 years, I've had cardiac related issues because about 20 years ago, I had an atrial fibrillation episode where I went into a couple hundred beats a minute. Since then, I've been cardioverted 4 or 5 times. They tried to stop my heart a couple times to get me back in rhythm. I have a stubborn heart. But long and short of it is, I knew my heart history already to some extent using conventional tactics, conventional measurement, EKGs, doctors. I had dye run through my body because I thought I might have had heart damage one time. Long and short of it is, I got the scan done, and Dr. Sam here is going to share some of that with you. And please share also, Doc, some of your experience and where you're at now and what you do. I would love to share that with everybody, in addition to just what my scan results were. And one other thing I want to share. Not only did he address the cardiac issues with this scan, but it led to solving, at least currently now, 3 weeks out, some issues tied to gut upset and GI upset. And I think that's really important because I know a lot of people suffer from that. Anyway, I'm really excited to have you here, and thanks for coming on.
Dan, it's good to be here. And, cardiovascular disease is something that we've known is reversible now for 30 years. But still, there's so many doctors that have yet to learn the techniques because you have to sit down long enough to learn it. There's a teaching objective that takes some time. Long story short, I've spent the last 25 years at least teaching aggressively. I have 53,000 doctors that are beginning to learn how to do this, but it's still a project in motion now. Plaque is a serious issue, and cardiovascular disease is a serious issue because it's the number one reason people die in the United States of America. It's the number one cause by far. In fact, if you added every cancer in the world put together, it wouldn't kill as many people as cardiovascular disease. If you take the next 4 causes of death put together, it's still cardiovascular disease leads in numbers. So if we address this issue aggressively, we can make a huge difference. And the problem is, if we don't address it aggressively, cardiovascular disease is fixing to get much worse. Back in the old days where we had heart attacks in the 50s, 60s, and 70-year age category, we're now fixing to start having them in the 30, 40, and 50-year category because there's changes on the horizon that are problematic. We have children now getting fatty livers. We have insulin resistance showing up at age 1. And never happened. I'm seeing 2 and 3-year-olds with fatty liver disease that came from food products that have products in them that basically set them up for failure. And so this new device sees 26 things about the heart that historically doctors have never been able to see before. And with this information, you can make some diagnostic issues come to light. And once you know what your target is, you can start affecting these patients rather quickly. And such is the case with you, and such is the case of thousands of others. We're now 3 million patients into this project. And so 3 million people have had this test done, and it's been a godsend for so many of them. There's just one story after another of people that just wouldn't be here today if they didn't have this information. But the smart thing to do is once this device gets known nationwide, because it's just been on the market a little over a year, but once it becomes more commonplace, and I think it will be in most every clinic in America in the not too distant future, you're going to see people getting these in yearly physical exams, and they're going to find out what their cardiovascular score is. It'll score something between 0 and 22, with anything over 4 being significant. But if you go to your doctor this year and your score is 1.2, and that's your cardiovascular score, and the next year your score is 2.0, you clearly are doing worse, but you're not at 4 level yet. So you're early enough to fix it before it gets severe. And it makes so much more sense to catch something early and do something about it rather than wait till something's incredibly severe and having to put stents in it or do bypass surgery or having to take heroic measures to save a life. Each time that happens, it's scary and it's unnecessary. I think this device is going to be a game changer. We have no products on the market that catch cardiovascular disease early until this device. So this device is going to change the paradigm. Catch it early, do something about it before it becomes severe, then we won't need the aggressive measures that have been used so heavily for the last few years.
It was interesting because I was smiling ear to ear when you and I talked a few weeks back. And in that few weeks, as I share with you, after some discoveries that you shared with me, I've lost about 8 pounds, maybe a little bit more. Not that I was necessarily, terribly overweight, but it just happened because I got off of some foods that we discussed as well, and that came out of some interesting things. When you think of a cardiac scan, you don't necessarily think, oh, this is also going to show possibly genetic anomalies, or because most of us think of cardiac scans as an EKG or something like that, and we're just seeing some sort of blips online on a screen. But this is so much more than that. This is, you said 3 million. I didn't know it was that many. 3 million patients have their data has been loaded into this, and from there we can project where people are now, where they're going. And I believe this has been over what, almost 3 decades that this data has been put into the machine, put into the scanner.
Close to it, about 25 years, and so it's been a long time in the making. The software that went into this artificial intelligence program is larger than Google. It's a massive effort. It's gone through the test of time now. We've got 13 peer-reviewed journal articles, but certainly there will be many, many more in the days to come. We can see coronary disease in its early state and do something about it before it happens. We can see people that are heart stiffening or going in the direction of heart failure, and we get 6 to 8 years warning before that actually becomes a clinical reality. And so in that 6 to 8 years, if we find out what's causing them this problem, and it's certainly doable with this device, you can then prevent them from ever having congestive heart failure.
Proactive lifestyle changes, I think, is how you said it. Getting it in advance before it becomes major. You had said to me, "Hey, Dan, it just might be a matter of just taking a couple different supplements to course correct for you now in 2024 versus 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now, where it maybe becomes major heart failure." So, yeah, it's fascinating.
And then it gets more complicated once the heart failure is clinical. So we can see these things early. We can see congenital heart defects. We can see when the rhythm disturbances are about to occur and do something about them before they occur. And there's so many aspects. We can see mitochondrial dysfunction of this, and mitochondria have to do with the organelles in a cell that make energy, but they do quite a few other things too, and they're vital to your system. And once you know you have this mitochondrial dysfunction, you can do something about it, because the mitochondrial dysfunction is not only causative for cardiovascular disease, but it's implicated strongly in the development of autoimmune illness and in cancers. So if you remedy this mitochondrial dysfunction, you basically can potentially prevent yourself from having a cardiovascular problem and avoid autoimmune illness and cancer.
Well, and you brought up the cancer thing. I had colon cancer
Mhm.
10 years ago. And I think it's tied to some of the things which I didn't know at the time, because my cardiologist of 20 years never knew all the things you knew in literally what was a 10-minute scan. He didn't know all that stuff because he didn't have that technology available to him to know all that. And armchair quarterbacking, you had said to me, "Hey, Dan, maybe this issue of this genetic issue that you got clued into from the scan, maybe that genetic issue is tied to your colon cancer, possibly even your atrial
Mhm.
fibrillation." But I'm happy to have you. You can share everything about my report. I'm an open book, and I'll have an open conversation so people can hopefully learn from this and benefit from
All right.
this.
I'll be glad to do whatever it takes to get this information out. if your doctor doesn't have one, you may want to talk to him about looking into the project, because once your doctor gets one, that opens this ability to help you immensely. And these things that I was just talking about are not little things. These are huge issues, and we've never had access to this information before. And it was absolutely amazing how this device came together and what it unfolds now. The world is open to amazingly in cardiovascular disease. I think artificial intelligence is going to become a way of life in many areas of our life in the days ahead, but this particular device is one of the very positive signs that artificial intelligence can be rather helpful in the right circumstances.
I'm just, I'm excited to have you share with the public here all the things that I learned about what was going on with my, not just my cardiovascular health, my health in general.
Do you want to put your report up and let them look at it? I was thinking if they saw what one looked like, they would see a little bit about the value of getting this test, because this little bit of information told me a lot about you before I even knew what was wrong with you. And once you started narrowing the field down, we were able to figure out what to focus on, and then the MTHFR needs to come up. And so if we bring up the MTHFR after that, and then you could talk about how you're symptomatically improved even in the early stages, and that's because you're starting to get nitric oxide now in a large way. That nitric oxide you get quickly. You got that within the first week to 10 days. And your brain chemistry is going to improve remarkably in the next 8 weeks. All right, now this is your MCG, the first one that you had done, and it looks like it was done half a year ago. And long story short is each one of those lines represent 82 seconds of an electrocardiogram tracing. You laid on that table for about 8 minutes, maybe 10 at the most, and they scanned you. So the bottom line was 82 seconds. The second from the bottom was the second 82 seconds, and so on. The first test starts at the bottom and goes up sequentially. If you notice under local results, you have the word present twice, and that means that you have single vessel disease. But then you look under global and you have present 4 times, which means you're moving into multivessel disease. So your disease is progressing, and that's problematic. But then as we look further down the report, we can find out that you have small vessel disease. Now, the ischemia level of the small vessel disease has got you at a severity level of 3, which is a mild level of dysfunction. But you don't want to let this get to moderate and severe, because small vessel disease is elusive and hard to take care of. Only 15% of men that have coronary disease have small vessel disease, but this disease, small vessel disease, is not visible on a nuclear stress test. It's not visible on a CTA of your heart. It's not visible on a heart cath. And so basically, if you were to have worsening disease and chest pains from your small vessel disease, if you got scanned by traditional techniques, you would not know that you had a problem. Your levels at 3, most people don't get in trouble with small vessel disease to their levels of severity, get a little bit above 6. And so small vessel disease starts about 6 to 8. People with large vessel disease have problems when their severity score gets around 4. So if you would scroll to the next page, and let's look and see what it shows about you. No, just the second page. Go back to there. You go. Can you get the words there? You're perfect. Now, there are 26 categories of things that we can see, and about half of them are on this page. And starting at the middle is one of the things that we look at first, where it says myocardial damage, because that plus all the way down the row of myocardial damage tells us that you have active metabolic diseases that are hurting your cardiovascular system right now. And what that means is you have inflammatory diseases that are putting inflammation in your blood vessels actively right now. And so that's an important thing to know, because some people have them and some don't. And once you know you have these disease states, most prudent people would want to do something. And once you do something about them and turn them off, those pluses will go to minuses. And when you go to minuses there, that's an incredibly positive event for your cardiovascular progression. Right next to it, the words myocarditis are written. And the myocarditis, I'm circling, hope you can see my arrow, is showing positive nature under every single category, every single 82-second test segment. So you most definitely have acute inflammatory metabolic disease states going on now. When we scroll to the next page and look at your myocardial remodeling on the left, you'll see that there's nothing going on there. So that ties in with chronic disease states. And that means you have acute disease, but you don't have chronic disease. That means what's been going on in you has been doing most of its damage over the last 2 years. If you look right next to it where it says decreased and increased myocardial compliance, if you had disease states in large vessels, we would see something in one of those categories. And by default, when your ischemia scores are 2 or above, which yours is at 3, and you have nothing in these two categories, by default, it means you have small vessel disease. And so that's how I knew you were in trouble in that area. Now take us back to that second page, and I want to show how simple this is for your patients' doctors to learn what's wrong and what to do. Now, if you look a little closer, you see that most of your problems under the pulmonary heart disease, which is your right-sided artery. So the vessels that seem to be involved most in you are the right coronary arteries and the circumflex arteries. There's 4 big arteries that circle the heart that create issues. The right-sided ones are less dangerous. Now, there very well could be some small vessel disease in the left side areas too, but none visibly apparent here, so that's good news for you. The next category on the second to the right, where it says congenital heart disease, is basically telling us that you have a congenital heart defect and you've already been told about a valvular issue. This machine is picking up on that. So your doctor will be able to pick up on congenital defects when it's not even apparent. And sometimes it's important to know about those things in advance so you can address them if need be.
Just so you know, so my dad had congestive heart failure. He led a different lifestyle, though, as far as what he ate. I've always
Mm-hmm.
been pretty conscious of what I eat. So, and interestingly, my dad also had atrial fibrillation. Um, you know, there doesn't seem to be a genetic component in our colon cancer because he also had that. So it's just bizarre how my dad had these things, and now some of these are showing up. I'm a little surprised actually because I've always felt I've taken care of my body well, exercise. My friends will tell you, Dan doesn't tend to eat a lot of junk. I'm not a drinker. I'm not a smoker. Never have been. And so this is fascinating to me to think. But I want to guess I stress to anybody watching this. This is exciting to me because I get to know this now instead of finding out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. And
Yes.
that's where the beauty is on this. So anyway, sorry. So please go on.
On the very left side of this report, you have all positives under cardiomyopathy, which means your heart is stiffening under the cardiomyopathy pathway. But if you look to the far right where it says ventricular hypertrophy, your heart is not stiffening through that pathway. So I see which direction is taking you toward heart failure. And then when I questioned you about the alcohol intake and you said you don't drink, and that's the number one cause for cardiomyopathy, I started posing other questions. And then insulin resistance was one of the next categories that is fairly large in this area. But usually when you see insulin resistance as a major player, you see ventricular hypertrophy showing up, and you had none. So that left me with the third most likely thing, which is a congenital issue that relates to a genetic mutation called MTHFR. That has to do with an enzyme that's deficient in patients, and you can have it heterozygously or homozygously, but at age 50 or above, either one would be affecting you rather severely. You got tested, it turned out you were homozygous for that mutation, which means you can't break folic acid down to methylfolate, which means you lack the ability to make 4 very important brain chemicals, specifically serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. When you can't make these chemicals, that affects your memory, that affects your energy, that affects your mood, that affects your desire to do things. You become a little bit more irritable, even if you're a nice person, and it tends to make you more withdrawn. even though you might be an outgoing person by nature.
Yeah, I am. And it's interesting because the memory thing is definitely, and I don't know if it was, my wife calls it chemo brain because ever since I did chemotherapy 10 years ago, she feels like it dropped off since then. But that was 10 years ago. I was 46. A lot of people start, and I'm not saying for right or for wrong reasons, but our memories tend to not always be as great, though I know there's plenty of exceptions, that some people would just say, oh, Dan, that's just part of aging. But as you and I both know, part of aging means there's some sort of degradation, in our biology, something that's not working right. And this might be a perfect thing that says, "Hey, Dan, this is what's going on." And I want to stress to anybody watching this right now, you know, it wasn't just a deficiency in the ability. It's that I'm of the 10% of the population that cannot process or methylate folic acid. And then Dr. Sam said to me, he's, Dan, you know what folic acid? And I'm like, yeah, like the enriched wheats, and we had a little further conversation about that. So again, I'm of that 10% of the population that can't break that down. 40% have the other variation of that gene, right, Dr. Sam? So, which is, so I had the extreme variation. I was on the scale. I was on like the dude. You can't process folic acid at all. 10% have a major difficulty, and you're one of those 10%. And Dan, I think that could explain some of your gastrointestinal issues that you've had, possibly even your colon cancer. And so the conversation kind of went from there, and that's when I got so pumped and excited, so much so that, as I think I already shared with you, I own one of these heart scanning machines and intend on continuing to promote and share it with people, and help people learn about their heart health. So
It also would have implications with your atrial fibrillation. So when you say your father had congestive heart failure and atrial fibrillation, and now you're seeing a genetic link, you say, how does this work? What would make this link? Well, see, when you don't have the chemical in your neurons, it's like not having gasoline in your car engine, except the difference between your brain and a car is there's a backup fuel for your brain. So you send a signal up a nerve and it won't fire. You send a second signal, a fifth signal, a 10th signal, and about the 15th signal, adrenaline comes to the back end of the nerve and jumpstarts your brain nerve function. And that is how your brain has been functioning. So before you had MTHFR issues activated, you ran normally, but when you started having an inability to make these chemicals, your levels of adrenaline went to this incredibly high level, much higher than you'd ever run before. And that triggered some things that would induce the atrial fibrillation automaticity. It made the workload for the heart much more severe. It's, in my opinion, the equivalent of drinking 5 Monster energy drinks a day and expecting to do well. When you circulate that much energy, that much adrenaline, it's caustic, it's inflammatory for your body. So it's like a no-win scenario. But now you talked about 10% of the population, and you're talking about the homozygous category of 677. If you take the 677 and 1298 together, homozygous and heterozygous, this is 50 to 60% of the American population. At age 50, none of them are methylating proper. And so you've got over half the country not methylating proper. You may ask yourself, why are so many people at age 50 on antidepressants? And it's this particular reason, because they're no longer making those chemicals and they're doing what they can to try to make use of what chemicals they can make to do something with, because they know that their brain's not right. They know that their memory's not right. They know that they're losing a battle. But
and I've been tested for the was it B12, and I was told years ago, Dan, your levels are low. You need to be on the cyanocobalamin or whatever that was, and then I inject it in my thigh once a month. I'm not a big fan of that because I didn't like the idea that it had cyanide in it. That kind of bothered me, and it's just fascinating how all these things are so interrelated. One of my favorite stories, and I can't remember if it was you, Dr. Sam, that shared it with me or not, but it was that if you have an arborist come out to your home to look at a tree because your leaves are turning brown, a smart arborist doesn't say, well, let's just start cutting branches. No, instead, he or she, the arborist, looks at the soil conditions and gives the proper nutrients to the soil so that the leaves can become green and healthy again. And that's what Dr. Sam is saying here. He's like, Dan, your body is not breaking down the folic acid.
That is correct. And it's also not making a chemical called nitric oxide. When you don't have methylfolate, you can't make those four brain chemicals. You cannot make nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is what puts the fire out. If you had your house on fire, you would want the fire truck to come down and put the fire out. And if you have your blood vessels on fire with inflammation, you want nitric oxide to come to your rescue. But these patients, by the age of 50, are not making nitric oxide. And thus, as they get inflammation, they're aging at an accelerated rate. So if you're ordinarily going to age at this rate, once you take nitric oxide out of the equation, you're aging much faster. So it'd be like a person you could be 50 years old in a 70-year-old body simply because you have been fighting this for quite some years.
I should get on some nitric oxide as well. Then it sounds like do some supplementation with that.
No, because after you've started the proper dose of methylfolate, within 2 weeks, you start making nitric oxide normally through the NOS system, which is the way you're supposed to have been making it all along. So you can correct it inside without any extra help. You can get nitric oxide through nitrates and nitrites, but that's a less efficient mechanism to do it. And why do that when you get the main mechanism back working? So if your body can't break folic acid down to methylfolate, it stands to reason, take the methylfolate. And then you have a supplement that basically corrects the problem. And, Dan, for years, doctors were trained your genetics were your lot in life. Whatever that's what you're burdened to bear. And that's just not true anymore. Nowadays, if you have a genetic issue, we learn how the genetics work, and we either downregulate the genetic mechanism or we bypass what the genetic mutation causes. So we're learning a lot more about SNPs and the things that do with single nucleotide polymorphisms, and it basically has to do with learning whether we can downregulate the genetic expression or bypass it, but they can just about all be treated once we understand how they work. And so in 2005, we found out about the MTHFR genetic mutation issue. In 2011, we found out what dose of methylfolate it took to treat it. In 2013, we found the dose for the 1298, and then we were off to the races. And if you could see the thousands of people that I've been exposed to with treatment for this, they don't get better. They get remarkably better. It's shockingly better. You feel better. You have more energy. Your mood gets uplifted. You no longer need these SSRIs and these antidepressants that people are having to take at these ages. You have less anxiety. And then you stop aging like a person that's much older than their stated age. And then if you do this correctly and learn that there's 11 disease states that can trigger cardiovascular disease, and most of these disease states can be exposed by this test that I'm talking about, you can then reverse it. So if you're a 70-year-old in a 50-year-old body, you can begin reversing that and then become a 60-year-old in a 50-year-old body, then a 50-year-old in a 50-year-old body, and a 40-year-old in a 50-year-old body, and start balancing the scales much better. You do not have to live with that wreckage that has taken place in years past, because we now know how to reverse the plaque and reverse the risk factors. But until this device, we never knew who had mitochondrial dysfunction and who doesn't. Once you see that, once you fix that, the risk for cancer goes down. The patients that are on this podcast now will see that even the autoimmune illnesses that they're experiencing now will start becoming treatable. And then they'll just go into remission. And then they'll basically just go away. Because once you remove the mitochondrial dysfunction, a lot of these issues become so easy to treat, they go in remission and just resolve. But until you get the mitochondrial dysfunction addressed, you're not going to be able to do that. There is no doctor in America that can identify mitochondrial dysfunction without using a research lab technique without this device. It's the only device on the market to do it. So there's so many things about this that are exciting. And we could go on and on about what it can tell and what it see, but by deductive reasoning and just asking you a few questions, I was able to take this test information and figure out exactly what was leading you into trouble. Once we tested it and confirmed it, we were off to the races. And so I think you're fixing to see Usually within 6 to 8 weeks of treating the MTHFR 677 mutation, you feel remarkably better, but you will continue to improve for a year and a half. So you will be your maximum improvement in a year and a half. But even in 8 weeks, I think you'll say, this is amazing how much better I feel now. I didn't realize how bad it was until you started fixing me. And the 1298s take about 3 months to start improving, but they will continue to improve over a 12-month, over an 18-month period. It's basically just life changing. And so all I can say is this device in the hands of doctors all over the country is going to change the way we address cardiovascular disease. It's going to improve our outcomes. I think 500,000 people a year that were scheduled to die will not die once this device becomes commonplace. And that says a lot. If you think about COVID and what it did to us, we're talking about 500,000 people a year, and this is almost the equivalent of that in cardiovascular disease that we can reverse. So imagine if we could reverse the scales for all these people, how many good people are going to get to live.
And I want to bring up something too, Doc, is the myocarditis. Was that something that I know certainly that topic has gotten explosive here in the last couple of years. I did not get vaccinated. I never got vaccinated, but yet I have some myocarditis, or some degree of myocarditis. So do you think that was derived because I did at some point have COVID? And that was just like the aftermath, or just myocarditis is part of either. It isn't just from COVID; it can come
Now,
from other things.
the terms that we use on the multifunctional cardiogram are terms that were approved by the FDA, but they don't speak the same language that myocarditis would say in the terms of an acute illness that might have been caused with the COVID issue. This term reflects acute inflammatory medical conditions, things that are acutely attacking your body right now on a day-to-day basis, while we have other diseases that do it chronically. Diabetes, for instance, and prediabetes would be more of a chronic related disease with some acute changes. But this MTHFR, because you circulate such high levels of adrenaline, it would be an acute phenomenon. Autoimmune illness would be rather acute because it's on a day-to-day basis doing damage and creating inflammation. An infectious issue like a Lyme's disease or a chronic infection with herpes zoster or one of the viral-related illnesses, including long COVID, that would play into this. Patients with long COVID have a lot of mast cell activation syndrome. That would play into this. And so there's acute illnesses, but there's chronic ones. It helps the doctor break it down into how the patient needs care and what needs to be emphasized. And then it lets you see 6 to 12 months down the road when you repeat the test if your therapy is working. If the therapy is working, those pluses that you see under myocarditis will start going away. That would be confirmation you're going the right track. If for some reason they weren't going away, it would suggest that while you may be treating some things that are helpful, you haven't hit all the magic buttons yet. So I think it's important for patients to realize that there is a new kid on the block that is going to make their future better. I would encourage them to talk to their doctor about multifunctional cardiograms, ask them if they've got one yet or if they've heard about them. If they haven't, we need to introduce them to this process. Your company can come into an office and do testing, and then they don't even have to purchase it to start with. They can start testing and learn about it. And once they do it on a regular basis, they may want to do it more often or eventually purchase one themselves. But the long story short, this technology needs to get in the hands of clinicians everywhere. Every single primary care doctor needs to be doing this. Every single cardiologist needs to do this. Every emergency room needs to be using this machine. And when that happens, you'll see the 500,000 a year that were scheduled to die not dying. And when that happens, longevity is going to go up tremendously, where people are living to 72 and 78 years of age now. It would probably not be unusual to live to 80 and 90 and 100. And the deal is, you say, well, some people say, well, I wouldn't want to live that long. Well, you might not if you felt bad, but what if you feel good? What if you could play golf and you're 99? I, that changes everything.
Awesome. That's great. So the big takeaways, if you've been watching this video, is that I sat in a chair for 10 minutes in Chicago at a health expo, and I had an opportunity to experience what was just a lead on each of my ankles and a lead on each wrist, and then one right on my chest, non-invasive. I was on it, as Dr. Salmon said, 8 to 10 minutes, and that's about right. I mean, I don't remember whatever, it was somewhere in there, 8 to 10 minutes, and I just had to sit still for 10 minutes. And what came out of that was something that might improve not only my heart health, but improve my gut health. And it already has, just in that short time. I was tipped off, or Dr. Sam, I should say, was tipped off when he interpreted the report to the fact that I might have this MTHFR gene. As it turns out, he was exactly right. He was spot on. I was one of 10% of the population that has this significant variant that makes my processing of folic acid virtually nothing, non-existent, which leads to heart issues, as we age in life. And aging prematurely now is something that might be more in my hands. I'm now using methylfolate, a supplement. I don't know how much though, Dr. Sam. I'll have to ask you that in a minute. But all this stuff came, and then even improving my memory. My memory at 56 years of age, it's not what it used to be. And my wife will say to me, like, "What do you mean you don't remember that? That was just like 6 months ago." I can sit and watch a movie. I can sit and watch a movie and in January, and I can watch that same movie again in August. And this I'm ashamed of this. This really bothers me because I've been mega dosing on vitamins, at least vitamin C, since the 80s. I've really tried to take care of my body from a nutritional perspective. But the fact that I can't remember a movie from January, 6, 8, 9 months later, and I can say I vaguely, I think I remember that. And she's like, "You're kidding me. We just watched this movie." Now the upside is I'm a cheap date because I can watch the same thing over and over again. But
in 6 months, that movie story is going to change because you're going to remember everything. And in 18 months, you're going to be shocked at the things you remember from 50 years ago because you're going to remember things that you thought you had lost memories of. The memories are still intact. They just need the chemicals to draw them out of the storage.
Okay, so it's funny because I'd always kind of thought it was a shutdown of neural pathways, so I wasn't able to access that data. And that's fascinating.
That is correct. You basically haven't been able to access it because of the lack of chemicals. But once the chemicals get back in place, every memory that you had comes back. You don't have to relearn it. You don't have to revisit it. You just get the chemicals back and it just comes. So watch what happens in 6 months and call me back and tell me what your wife says.
I mean, so I was fascinated, and thank you so much for taking your time to do this. We both want to spread the word, and again, just thank you so much, Dr. Sam. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.